Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Gunal Chish, and thank you so much for taking the time to join Salmon Beyond Borders and Conservation Northwest, as well as our distinguished panelists for this evening's webinar, Beyond the Skagit, where we will be focusing in on British Columbia's existing and potential large-scale mining projects in the headwaters of rivers shared with Washington State. Many thanks for those who already submitted questions in advance. And please note that there will be time at the end of the panelists' remarks for Q&A. And you'll notice at the bottom of your screen, there's a question and answer box that you can populate during the webinar. And we've got a great support team tracking those questions and organizing them for the end. Additionally, this webinar will be recorded. My name is Jill Weitz, and I will be one of your moderators this evening. I live on the ancestral lands of the Taku and Aquan Tlingit people in what is more commonly known as Juneau, Alaska. I work for an organization called Salmon State, and I direct a campaign called Salmon Beyond Borders. Our team works closely with many partners throughout multiple United States and British Columbia transboundary regions, including the Southeast Alaska Indigenous Transboundary Commission, which represents 15 of the 19 federally recognized tribes in Southeast Alaska. In Northwest British Columbia, there are more than 12 large-scale open pit mines in various stages, ranging from abandonment to development and operation, near the headwaters of rivers that flow into Southeast Alaska's infamous Inside Passage waterways. Our shared rivers, the Taku, Stikine, and Unic, are the three largest salmon-producing rivers of this region, most notably producing 80% of our king salmon, and now whose headwaters face unprecedented development in British Columbia. However, the situation does not replicate itself. It replicates itself across multiple jurisdictions, including Washington, obviously, but we have learned a significant amount through our work with experts, non-government organizations, and tribes in Montana and Idaho who are already facing the impacts of upstream mining pollution from Southeast British Columbia. You will hear plenty this evening about the regulatory mechanisms in place, but just know that currently, British Columbia has non-binding memoranda of understanding with Alaska, Washington, Idaho, and Montana that not only lack enforceability, but also mechanisms in place to hold mining companies liable for impacts, as well as hold a seat at the table for tribes and First Nations to engage in the management of these shared rivers. Therefore, under the Boundary Waters Treaty of 1909, we, along with our partners, have been calling on our federal governments to secure binding and enforceable protections for our shared rivers that have been at the center of wildlife, culture, and commerce since time immemorial. We are honored to be with you all this evening, with many thanks to our distinguished panel and our support team of Bree, Chase, and Keiko. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce my co-moderator and the Executive Director of Conservation Northwest, Mitch Friedman.
Thank you, Jill. And the jet's coming over my home at just the right time. I'm the Executive Director of Conservation Northwest. I'm delighted you could all join us here this evening. I'm here in my home in South Seattle. And you're used to, those of you familiar with Conservation Northwest, probably think of us in terms of protecting and restoring forests, linking habitats, and recovering wildlife in Washington and southern British Columbia. We haven't worked on mines typically, but we've become increasingly aware of their impacts. And this exceptional campaign that Salmon Beyond Borders and other First Nations and US groups in Montana and elsewhere have been running to try to bring to bear the interests of states to help bring about British Columbia better regulating its mining industry. It affects us in Washington almost as much as anywhere. There's more than 24 mines in various states of exploration or development or extraction along the Washington-British Columbia border. Most people have heard about the threat to the upper Skagit River watershed, and you'll hear a lot about that tonight, the so-called donut hole. But it isn't just the Skagit. The Similkameen, which drains the east side of the Cascades in British Columbia, the Okanagan, the Kettle River just east of there, and of course the Columbia, all flow out of BC and mined mountains into Washington. And there's a lot we have to learn from that and a lot we have to be concerned about. And we'll hear about that tonight. Our first panelist is Rob Edward, who's coming to you from the Similkameen, actually from the area around Costin and Karameas, just north and west of Orville on the BC side. Rob is the former chief of the Lower Similkameen Indian Band, a specialist and leader in the traditional knowledge community of the Similkameen and the Seal Okanagan Nation peoples. And Rob, welcome. Please get us started. You're muted, Rob.
Okay, I think I got it now. While Maiko Yako Ulo Salau, Papalmente ma Gai he kink and tickle seal that created to me new. Le Gestamintum. Anyway, I'll open with a prayer. We always pray when we talk about our sacred things. So while I'm not willing to has to have skill. Ja, te have school that I look self steam. He tell had take school that. That's a school that's why say the hula hula. He switched that. Which gives them look self steam. That's the the school that. While I'm not willing to. So I just like to thank you guys. And I'll introduce myself. Why has to hold this question caption? Can Similkameen. And I'm Titula Skamakin Skano system. My name is Rob Edward. I come from Chapaka, in a place that has a name of I guess our relationship with the Stolo people, Skamakin, and they were in this area. So I'm not sure what I'm supposed to talk about, but I know, just out from my heart, everything I do comes from Chaptik. And I was really fortunate to learn this from my dad and elders that, came throughout the nation and neighboring nations. My dad knew all the languages. He was born in 1886. And to me, that was so awesome and so privileged. I was born and he was 71 in 1957. And, the relationship with my mom didn't last long because it was a January, December type of relationship. But then they had my sister who lives on the island, Vancouver Island, which we call Ksun. And we know all our people through trade. And the other thing is, Rick, when people say, well, how does the water, impact our livelihood? Through our water, the Milkait is what we're named after. It's Similkameen. And the Mitwa, or Mithuit, the Mitwa. We know the Skagit, through two venues, which we could talk about another day, I guess. But when we look at salmon, it ties us all together as seal, as scale, right up into Alaska. When we look at where does our salmon go when they go down and they spawn, they come up, they spawn, and then they go back down into the ocean. the big water. And where do they go? And we depend on all the nations to make sure that they return, that we have, you know, favorable returns that we used to see back in the day. Like in my dad's time, he went to a place called Kettle River, you know, Falls, Kettle River Falls. He was even at Schuyler Falls. You know, like I said, he knew the Yakima language, the Sapnich, the Nez Perce, the dialects in the Seal, you know, the Littlewood, the Thompson, the Siwatmich, a little bit of Blackfoot. So I was really privileged, like when we used to travel and go to Omak to gatherings there, you know, the Omak Stampede back in its day, and the Spelem, the gathering there, and other gatherings in other communities. And I'd hear these people talking about relationships and how that was done through water. And Coyote, he brought salmon up. You know, the whale was the one that was holding the water. He made the dam down there at Schuyler Falls. And how Coyote brought our chief and DT up for us. And then how to, you know, come down to the Similkameen, and, you know, he came right up into the area we call Skagit, Princeton area. He chased the salmon that far, but there was no takers for salmon because the women liked the backs of the bighorn sheep. That was their delicacy. So he chased them back, and around the Loomis area, he kind of got mad, you know. He got mad at the smoke, and so he grabbed the siap bush, which is another one of our chiefs in the Four Foods, and he whipped the ground. You can see that if you ever traveled that little canyon before Endowment Dam, it's all kind of ripped up, and that was our penalty, I guess, was to have to travel a tough trail to go and get salmon. So we look at our river, you know, like because of legislation and laws that we're not included in because of colonization and marginalization, I guess, of our people, is we're not included in the new Water Act in British Columbia. We weren't allowed, you know, really to have water for our reserves that we have up here. But we take water anyway. You know, we're sovereign people. Like we say, we've never ceded our land to anyone, the crown or otherwise. So when we look at that, you know, a lot of concepts, I guess, through water. As I was talking to a group of students today, we're training a bunch of new technicians, natural resource technicians today. And our garden is so huge. We call it our territory. And that was our garden. So you look at, and Pisos is not a concept that we got when the colonizers came and said, you know, you Indians are going to live on this reserve and you guys are going to be farmers. We were already farmers on a really huge scale. When we look at, you know, creating ecosystems by irrigating an area, and, you know, they say, you make a ditch for that water and then you spread it out and it creates an ecosystem. And how we utilized I guess maybe it's a weakness in a beaver, of how he hears running water and he's got to stop it. And we utilize that to create these ecosystems for our foods, like the wild celery and the different medicinal things that we need out in some of these areas. So when I look at our downstream neighbors, you know, we've always shared, we call that Poixtmentum. We shared with all of our people, and then they shared with us. The interband trade, the trade with internations, like we knew our neighbors because of trade. Highway 3, you know, the Crow's Nest, that's a trade trail. The Ashinola Corridor is a shortcut to that trade trail. The Hudson's Bay, they never hacked anything except for blaze the trail for their fellow man to not get lost on these wide trails that were already put there by our trade. And trade didn't just happen when, like I told these students today, when Columbus showed up or Western civilization started to influence us. We were already traders. We had people that were strictly trading people. And Soke was their customers. So when I look at water, you know, the waterways, I'd ask my dad, okay, we're coming from Revelstoke. How would you get a buffalo hide from there to here? Because a buffalo hide is heavy. How would you bring it? He said, well, you look at the water. It comes down, you jump on a canoe, you come down, you pack 3-4 buffalo hides, you portage here and there, you through the Columbia River, you come up to the Okanagan River, then you hit the Similkameen River. It's a lot easier to pack those buffalo hides that we get to trade with the Siksika and the Taik and the Blackfoot and the Siksika on the plains. So water has a really big significance for us. Our name comes from there. Milkit, Smilkanich, Mithuit, Mithwa, and you look at the Skagit, you know, the upper Skagit people. So when we look at those kind of things, you know, and we look at the mines now, like for the past 50 years or so, 40, 50 years, I haven't fed my family from the river. Because when we start looking at the river, it starts to get the sludge in the river. And then you wonder, well, is that in the fish? You know, there you hear tidbits about, you know, selenium and arsenic and all this other stuff that they use to extract gold and whatever they want out of the river. And then you look at, you know, we're talking about it here in our community. We're talking about people that are getting sick. You know, we're saying, well, how many natural deaths were they? A lot of our people are dying from cancer. And it could be because of the food we're eating, maybe. And when you look at beef, you know, it's got hormones. Chicken has hormones. We don't know if it's that. And then we don't eat our fish anymore. And there's nobody to tell us, well, yeah, you can have a fillet of fish or one trout or whatever, because our livelihoods came from that river. You know, when I look at that, I said the mine has a big impact on that. And there was a Mascot mine at the beginning, and it was Similkameen mine prior to Copper Mountain. And there's other mines up towards Tulameen. So when I look at our tech knowledge that I have of our land, and the balance is upset. You know, our trout, they're raised in a hatchery. They're not the, you know, 16, 24, 30-inch trout that we used to get. They're not the whitefish that we used to get in February. They're not the suckers that we used to gaff. And our old people, the delicacy for them was the heads. You know, it's just like salmon head soup. So when we look at those kind of things, you know, the river and the water quality has a really big thing for us. In our understanding, when we learned from Saptik, is that we don't try to regulate water so that we captivate it or we capture it or we try to hold it. It has to run free. It has to be clean. And when we look at our Tamil, they keep it clean. All the ecosystems keep it clean. We have the headwaters up there of the Similkameen, a place we call Satit. Satit means it's like a sieve. Water rains up there, or, you know, comes from snowfall, then it seeps through the ground and acts like a filter. And then it starts to flow out and it's clean. But as it comes down, it gets influenced by mining activity, farming. You know, it probably has an impact because of the fertilizers and that. But mining is a really big issue here. because, you know, we were dealing with this speller, I can't remember what his name was, Giles, and he was telling us about, you know, unpotable water, and our cattle drink out of there, our kids swim in there. Some of our people still get fish from there. So when we start asking these questions, you know, they do studies on our water, they'll take tests, and we're asking, well, what's in the study? Well, they give us a sheet of paper that's may as well be hieroglyphics, because I don't know how to read a water study or quality or thing that they have. But we don't have the money to say, well, you know, somebody read this for me, interpret this for me. So I'm not sure how much time I have, but when I look at this, our relationship all intertwined with water. Right up to Alaska, when we look at our salmon and where they go, and our food source, food sovereignty is a big issue right now. Like, you know, we're fighting with the mine to get some of these environmental levies and different things in put in, and there was nothing. You know, we were saying, well, how about 25 cents per ton? And because when things happen, they're going to happen, just like at Mount Polly. We were at Mount Polly before it came down, and we're looking at this thing, and, you know, oh, this is going to be forever. It can withstand, you know, a 7.8 or 8 magnitude earthquake and all this and all that. And, you know, we come home and Copper Mountain is telling us the same thing, and this is going to be all good, and you know, it's going to be good for your community, and it's going to be, but the trade-off is really devastating when we look at Mount Polly as an example. And then you look at the other example that took forever was that, like I said, for 40 years, I've never ate a fish out of the Similkameen River. I'd go to the creeks, you know, where I know there's trout in there that live in there year round, just one above my place. And I go and catch a trout or two, and then I'd fry that up, or the ashnola, you know. But even that's getting less and less because of the impacts of tourism and different things. So when I look at that, you know, for me,
maybe we should move on, and we'll come back in the questions and learn a little bit more.
Okay, oh, I'm good. Thank you.
I think you've done a great job setting things up. And a little bit later, when Amelia Marchand talks from the Colville Tribes, you'll get a perspective on how the Similkameen flows into the Okanagan and into the Columbia and other rivers. But now I want to shift back over to the west side of the mountains in the Skagit. We're honored to have Scott Schuyler here. He's a fisherman and works in natural resources and culture for the Upper Skagit Tribes. Scott, it's all yours.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. First off, I have to thank Rob for sharing that traditional prayer with everybody and starting this off right. So, Haishka, Rob, thank you. Again, my name is Scott Schuyler. I'm a member of the Upper Skagit Tribe. I am now a tribal elder now. I've been around long enough. And I have fished the Skagit for the last 40 years, plus years now. I want to tell you a little bit about the Upper Skagit and what the river means to us. Our people, our villages line the Skagit River, if you know Washington State at all, from Mount Vernon basically to the upstream of the New Halem area. And our people were once considered very rich, if you would. Not in a European sense of gold and silver. We didn't have that type of wealth. What we had was a river that took care of us. It sustained our people. It provided us with everything we needed. And the river produced huge salmon runs that brought us prosperity. Its cold, clean water kept us safe and healthy and sustained our hunter-gatherer culture for last 10,000 years. In our history, in our lore, our guardian spirit of wealth resided in the, if you know the Skagit at all, the cold waters of the Dalles, near concrete. That's where our guardian spirit of wealth resided and protected us and kept our people sustained. A little bit about the history. I'm a direct descendant of Pteus, who signed the treaty on a cold January day in 1855 with the United States. And by doing so, he reserved the right for Upper Skagit to continue to fish this very day. When my ancestor done that, when Pteus done that, he did that with the intent that the river would remain whole, clean, and protected, and still be able to take care of us. He did not envision, you know, what had occurred in the last 150 years. By signing the treaty, we sacrificed virtually all of our ancestral lands in exchange for this right to continue to fish, and with a thought that the river would remain whole, of course. He couldn't have imagined what was going on to this day, or what would go on with the pollution and chemicals that our salmon are subjected to throughout their entire life cycle. And now we have to be concerned about the safety of the salmon that we eat. You know, the picture that is on the screen there, that's a picture of my great-grandfather. He was a great shaman from the Eastern Mountains, from the Colville, Walter Sam, and my great-grandmother, Lottie Sam. They lived along the Skagit in their little cedar plank cabin there that still stands this day. And they drank river water throughout their entire lives up until the point when Lottie passed away in the early 80s and Walter in the early 90s. And in fact, my family, when at our fishing camp, we used to drink river water up into the 1970s too, and then it became a little sketchy, if you would. And you know, the fact that we have to be concerned about the river being safe to drink is a huge issue for us. Like Rob, I think Rob stated it, you know, we use the river for a lot of purposes, for bathing and cleansing our spirit. And we shouldn't have to be concerned that going into the water is a safety issue for us. We need that clean water free of man-made toxins. We have a moral obligation to protect these two beautiful watersheds, the Similkameen and the Skagit, from further degradation. The Skagit, I can speak to what's gone on in the last 100 years. We, mankind, have done virtually everything we could possible to degrade the river. The Skagit, for those of you that know the Skagit, there's 3 dams on the main stem that were built by the city of Seattle. And one of the most grievous offenses, to at least to my people, is the fact that our river is currently dewatered above New Halem. And so we have to live with that, knowing that, and deal with that every single day that this type of stuff goes on. And of course, logging activities. So we're very concerned what's going on in the headwaters. We want to make sure that everybody works together to protect the Skagit. It is our sacred river. We believe that, you know, we're borrowing everything that we have today from our kids and their kids. And so it's important that we protect what we have now, and we try to make things better. I guess the message that I want to close with is that, and we're all aware of this, that everything that we do affects those downstream of us. But it's in the context of not just the Skagit. What goes on in the headwaters goes into the Salish Sea and affects everybody's watersheds, the orca, all the marine mammals, and the salmon that we all rely on. So I want to thank everybody again. It's an honor to be here tonight, and I will be available to answer any questions that anybody may have about the Skagit. So thank you. Haishka.
Haishka, Scott, thank you so much. Thank you, thank you. Next, we will be hearing from Dr. Dave Chambers, who is a geophysicist and president of the Center for Science and Public Participation.
Thank you, Jill. I'm just going to give you a quick tutorial on mining this evening. So what is metal mining? Metal mining is all about getting a small amount of sulfide minerals that are mixed in with a lot of other rock. And almost all of the metals we use are originally formed as what are called sulfide minerals. That is a metal ion like iron plus a sulfur ion. And those compounds are formed deep in the Earth's crust. They're raised to the surface through volcanic action. And when they're exposed on the surface to air and to water, they're no longer stable. And these sulfide minerals break down. And when they do break down, that is, the metal disconnects chemically from the sulfur ion, what we're left with eventually is a weak sulfuric acid. And that's what causes most of the problems associated with mining and water, is that acid drainage, weak sulfuric acid. The other significant thing is the amount of waste that's produced when we mine this material. Virtually all of the material that comes out of a mine is waste. There's very little sulfide mineral, very little metal in that. For your typical copper or lead zinc mine, both of which occur in this region, about 98% of everything that comes out of the ground is waste. And if we have a gold mine, again, common in the Pacific Northwest, over 99% of everything that's mined is going to end up as waste. And all of this waste stays on the mine site. Now for mining, we're generally talking about two kinds of waste. First is the waste rock, and that is any material that doesn't have an economic amount of whatever it is you're trying to mine, copper, lead, zinc, gold, whatever. So that becomes waste. And that's not processed, but it has to be moved in order to get at the ore material. And for an open pit mine, there's typically 1 to 2 times as much waste rock generated as ore. So there's a lot of waste material to store. And in fact, a good portion of the water quality problems that I've seen over the years are associated with that waste rock. The other type of waste we deal with are what are called tailings. And that's just when you take the ore, and as we see in this picture, you mine it and then you grind it up and you mix it with water and you separate out the metal sulfide that you're interested in. And then what's left over becomes tailings. That's all finely ground material, and it needs to be placed somewhere, basically for eternity. And both of these materials, the waste rock and the tailings, contain metals that are not wanted. That is, things other than copper or lead and zinc, depending on what kind of mine you have. And those are things like mercury, cadmium, selenium, arsenic, and a list of other things. These low levels of unrecovered target metals can pose a risk to the environment because of their toxicity. So give me my next slide, please, if you would, Jill. The Tulsa, this is the Tulsa Chief mine in British Columbia, very near the Alaska border and Juneau. And what we're looking at is waste rock, and it's orange. And there are 2 reasons that it's orange. 1, nothing will grow on it. And 2, it's generating that acid I was talking about. And that's leaching the rock itself. In this case, it's leaching iron out of the rock, and it's the iron that gives the rock the color. And you can actually see some water in the foreground. That's the Tulsa River in the background, by the way. But that water has been contaminated. And we can see water flowing down the hill from the right of the picture. There's actually a mine tunnel up there, and there's water coming out of that tunnel, and you can see what it's doing to those metal pipes that have been left there. It's actively corroding them. So controlling this contamination is one of the most difficult problems that a mine has to face. In order to hold back those tailings that I was talking about, you need a tailings dam. That is a structure to hold back all this finely ground, loose, wet material. There are 3 types of ways you can build these tailings dams. The most conventional way is in the lower right-hand corner. That's called downstream construction. There's what's called a centerline construction, where you basically take that downstream and cut it down the middle and only build the lower half of it. And then there's a construction type called upstream, where you actually use the tailings themselves as a partial support for the dam itself. Now, tailings dam failures don't happen all that often, but they're what we call low probability but very high consequence events. And the type of construction that has given the mining industry the most problem for over 100 years is this upstream type. Why do people use that construction if it's dangerous? Well, the cost of a tailings dam is directly related to the amount of material it takes to construct it. And as you can sort of see from these cartoons, the least amount of material is associated with upstream type construction. And so although a downstream type and even centerline are much safer, they're also more expensive to build. But we have to think about what happens if we lose control of one of these structures and it fails. And that's exactly what happened at Mount Polley, which is a copper gold mine in south central British Columbia. Mount Polley was a dam that couldn't fail. And it was said that it couldn't fail because it was designed by a reputable consulting company. It was managed by a responsible mine operator, and it was regulated by the best mine regulatory system in the world. By the way, in my experience, all regulatory jurisdictions, whether it happens to be British Columbia, Alaska, Nevada, Montana, where they all have the best one in the world, but that's another story. So why did Mount Polley fail? Well, that dam failed basically for 2 reasons. One, it was built on top of a glacial lake that went undetected by the geotechnical drilling. So there's a technical error there. And then the dam was oversteepened as it was being built. It was originally designed to go out 2 feet horizontally for every 1 foot of elevation that it was increased. But that horizontal angle was steepened, and it was actually, instead of being 2 to 1, it ended up being 1.3 to 1 horizontal to vertical. Now you can think about the effect of that if you think about stepping on a banana. If you have a very small foot and you step on the banana, you're a lot more likely to slide than if you have a big foot like me and step on that same banana. So by steepening the dam, you decrease the footprint of the dam and you put more pressure on the material that the dam is being built on. So what happened at Mount Polley is this dam failed because it was built over a glacial lake, a banana, if you will, that they didn't know was there. And it was putting more pressure than what they thought was being put on that weak material. If they had known the glacial lake was there, then they wouldn't have oversteepened the dam. If they hadn't oversteepened the dam, if they built that dam as originally designed, even the lake wouldn't have caused the failure. So it took both of those critical mistakes to make that dam failure happen. Why did this happen? Well, obviously engineering failed to detect the glacial lake. The operating company was pressed for cash, and they concentrated on producing ore, not waste rock needed to construct the dam. That's why it was built at a steeper angle. And then the regulators allowed this to happen, trusting the engineers and the operator, but not verifying the information that they were being given was correct. So I think there's substantial blame on all hands involved at that particular site. There was an expert panel that was convened by the province itself to review the Mount Poly failure. And the expert panel listed a bunch of recommendations to try to avoid failures like this in the future. One of the things I've done over the past several years is to review those regulatory changes and compare those with those panel recommendations. And my conclusion is that BC has only partly addressed those recommendations. I'm going to stop there. If you're interested in learning more about that comparison, the First Nations Energy and Mining Council has put out a brochure on that. I'm sure they'd be happy to send it to you if you ask them. Thank you, Jill.
And keep in mind, we will have hopefully plenty of time at the end for Q&A. I know my brain just always goes off with questions when I hear Dave give a talk. And without holding it up any further, I would like to introduce Dr. Daniel Schindler, who is a professor of aquatic fishery sciences at the University of Washington in Seattle.
Thanks, Jill. Thank you for the invitation to participate tonight. And I also want to thank both Rob and Scott, who actually laid out a really nice introduction to many of the things I'll say about the importance of water, fish, and how they can be affected by mining activities in a variety of different ways. Because time is short, I'll cut really to the chase and really hit a few points that I think are worth thinking about, and I'm guessing many of the people on the call tonight are fully aware of already. First of all, the potential effects of mining on water quality and fish, and therefore on people, are really multidimensional. Dr. Chambers just talked about a few of the risks associated with extracting sulfide-rich ore and the problems of containing wastes on the landscape for centuries into the future, which produces contaminants which can leak into water supplies and impact fish habitat and fish health, and therefore people's health. What's also important to recognize is that mining impacts on habitat go beyond the simple effects of contaminants. Mining requires things like roads and moving water around. These are very wet landscapes. That's one of the reasons they're so productive biologically. But the things that make these watersheds productive for organisms like salmon make those same watersheds difficult for containing interactions between surface waters and groundwaters, for instance, which makes containing contaminants problematic. Water also has to be rerouted, and in many cases, small streams can be dewatered or their flood regime can change. Roads also prevent the rivers from meandering across their floodplains in natural ways that actually produce the habitat complexity that fish have evolved the ability to exploit and actually require to complete their life cycles. The point simply is that the effects of mining on fish habitat the list is long, much beyond the simple effects of contaminants, which we typically tend to think about. And what's more problematic for assessing risks of any given project is that many of these factors interact with each other, which means that when you both reduce the amount of water in a river and you contaminate what water's left, the impacts of each of those stressors is more when you put them together. So we have a list that we could put our heads together to come up with that would be dozens of factors long, and many of these factors will interact to cause big potential problems for salmon and for water quality, and therefore for people down the road. The second issue that I think is important to recognize is that many of these effects are not going to play out in the next 5 years, 10 years, even 20 years. We need to think about this over the long term. And as I think it was Rob who mentioned, or maybe it was Scott, you know, what we're talking about are risks not to us, but to our kids and probably to their kids. And when we think about the ecological impacts of mining activities now, those impacts will probably play out over the next few centuries, not the next few years that all of us on this call today are primarily going to be exposed to. Another thing that is worth mentioning is that when we read proposals from people who want to develop projects like these, we often hear promises about the ability to rehabilitate or mitigate or restore ecosystems after the mine has been developed and fully exploited. And the reality is, if we look at our history of being able to successfully restore watersheds once we've messed them up with mines, there are two things that pop right to the top. One is we're very ineffective at doing restoration. And second, it's incredibly expensive. So even in places where we pour literally millions of dollars into trying to clean up the messes left behind by development projects, in many cases, they simply don't work. Again, the time frame is relevant here because in many cases it will take decades, if not centuries, to contain what's left behind from projects like this. So we need to be very skeptical of promises about conservation, about restoration and mitigation moving into the future. And I guess the last thing that I'd like to mention is that, you know, these, as we heard from some of the first two speakers, you know, these ecosystems have a lot of intrinsic value right now, and they also have defensible, definable economic value right now. And it's often the case that we hear that things like mines have to be developed because we can't afford not to develop them because they're going to generate so much revenue. But promises like that and arguments like that really need to be balanced against valuations of what those ecosystems are worth right now. And when we talk about what they're worth right now, we're talking about cultural values, spiritual values, and in fact, economic values. The fish that return to the Skagit, for instance, in the past have supported very valuable recreational and commercial fisheries. And in many cases, those types of resources can be sustainable into the future and continue to generate dollars that many decision makers are particularly interested in. So that's all I have to say tonight, and I'm happy to follow up later if people have questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Schindler. It's very informative. Our next panelist is Amelia Marchand, who directs the Environmental Trust Department, the Confederated Tribes of the Kavel Indian Reservation. And Amelia is also a boss of mine. She's on the board of Conservation Northwest.
As Mitch introduced, my name is Amelia Marchand, and I'm Okanagan, Chief Joseph Band of Nez Perce, Moses Columbia, Palouse, and Arrow Lakes, a citizen of the Colville Confederated Tribes, born and raised on the Kavel Reservation in Washington State. I'm joining you this evening from the traditional territory of the Nespelam tribe. I serve as the program director for the Colville Confederated Tribes Environmental Trust Department, as Mitch said. I'm so pleased to participate in this event and so thankful for the hearts, minds, and hands of Salmon Beyond Borders and Conservation Northwest for organizing and facilitating the meeting. With the short amount of time I have, I'll be talking briefly about the Kavel Tribes, the land that we know, the department that I work with. So the Kavel Tribes is a confederacy of 12 tribes, not because we chose to form alliances and be friends, but because assimilation and forcible removal was practiced by the colonizers. Collectively, our indigenous peoples have been the caretakers of the lands and waters throughout the inland Northwest region for time immemorial. Our ancestors relied upon this diverse ecosystem for survival, sustenance, transportation, health, culture, and community, just as we do today. Our cultural continuity, physical and spiritual health is dependent upon access to and availability of a resilient and functioning ecosystem rich with diversity. The land, which is now known as the state of Washington, came under U.S. jurisdiction when the Oregon Treaty with Great Britain in 1846 divided the so-called Oregon Territory between the U.S. and Canada at the 49th parallel. This treaty divided the lands of several Colville tribes and other indigenous relatives and friends into two separate Western governmental jurisdictions. And Euro-American immigrants entered our territories for settlement and colonization and resource extraction. Starting in the mid-1850s, gold was discovered in Northeast Washington and southern British Columbia, spurring new waves of immigrants into the region to establish man camps, focusing singularly on obtaining precious metals without regard to indigenous homelands. Prospectors moved into lands and assumed ownership without any discussion or agreements with any of the 12 tribes of the Kavel Reservation. These intrusions by miners and squatters were not welcomed. Prospecting expeditions traveling on the Oregon Trail would turn north onto the Caribou Trail in Walla Walla and were warned by Chief Moses of the Moses Columbia tribe as they traveled through his land that they would be met by tribes defending their homelands from this invasion. We're still defending our homelands and waters. The Kavel Reservation was established by presidential executive order in 1872 and is bounded on the east and south by the Columbia River and on the west by the Okanagan River. It includes nearly 1.4 million acres of land in northeastern Washington state, with about 4,500 miles of waterways and over 1 million acres of land identified as lands held in trust by the Federal Department of the Interior's Bureau of Indian Affairs. Much of the Colville tribe's traditional territories continue to be protected federal lands, 2 national recreation areas, one of which is on the reservation, 1 national historic site, and portions of 3 national forests. Our tribal citizens retain hunting, fishing, and gathering rights on the former north half of the reservation for time immemorial, the majority of which are now known as the Colville National Forest. 4 federal dams on or adjacent to the reservation are also present, 2 BIA dams on the reservation, 1 managed by the Army Corps of Engineers on the Columbia River at Bridgeport, Washington, which is near the mouth of the Okanagan River, and 1 managed by the United States Bureau of Reclamation at Coulee Dam, Washington, which is just about 1.5 miles from where I'm sitting. Based upon the inherent sovereignty and constitution of the Colville tribes, several tribal laws regulating water use, water quality, hydraulic activities, aggregate use, and hazardous substances have been enacted by the tribal government. These laws, called codes, apply to surface and groundwaters within the reservation and are administered by my department, the Environmental Trust Department. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, has promulgated water quality standards for the reservation in 40 CFR 131.35. The Kabul Tribes has treatment as a state, or TAS, authorization for sections 106, 303C, 319, and 401 of the Federal Clean Water Act, and is also designated as a reservation covered by the Federal Air Rules for Indian reservations, and coordinates with EPA on the implementation of new federal air quality laws impacting the reservation. Interests of the Colville tribes in water and air quality, terrestrial and aquatic habitats, and cultural resources extend beyond the boundaries of the reservation throughout our traditional territories and usual and accustomed lands, and rely upon protections required by other tribal, state, federal, and international jurisdictions. We also acknowledge the over-allocation of water resources on and adjacent to our reservation, particularly the allocation of the Okanagan River watershed in British Columbia and Washington state by agricultural and development interests. For decades, the Colville tribes have led the way in investigating industrial pollution in the Upper Columbia River. Specifically, the section of the river between Grand Coulee Dam and the US-Canadian border, resulting with a significant lawsuit against Tekkaminko for their smelter activities in Trail, British Columbia. The Colville tribes has also opposed mining on the reservation and within our traditional territories. We have supported the litigation brought forth by the Okanagan Highland Alliance against the Buckhorn Gold Mine, which is located within the former north half of the reservation in the Sandpoil River watershed. I approach the work I and my coworkers are tasked with through the lens of climate change, food and water sovereignty, and environmental protection. Our staff serves on intergovernmental and interdisciplinary teams for natural resource damage assessments and emergency response to wildfires, flooding, and windstorms. Through this work, we are reminded that we as humans are a part of the ecosystem, not apart from it. It is important for us to recognize that this is not a question of what mine will pollute or contaminate waters, or who owns or regulates it, or even where engineering failures will occur. This is not an if-then hypothetical question. It is a when-how problem we must begin solving now. And I'm glad to be here and to be a part of this. Thank you.
Thank you, Amelia. That was excellent. I really appreciate you joining us tonight. And next, we're going to go back to the west side of the mountains again. Ken Farquharson, you've been at this longer than any of us from the early days in the Upper Skagit. Ken is joining us from his home in the lower mainland of British Columbia. Maybe share with us your history and your thoughts on the Upper Skagit, please.
Well, thank you, Mitch, and it's a pleasure to be a guest company of panelists. I don't feel superbly qualified in listening to the others. However, the story of the Upper Skagit in BC is interesting. It ties into High Ross. The Seattle City Light designed that dam to be built in 2 stages. The first was approved during the period of the last war, and in the post-war period, they began to make noises about raising the dam. Yet at the same time, in the regional planning studies in the lower mainland of BC in about 1963, Skagit Valley was identified as one of the prime recreation resources for the people of the Lower Mainland. And what were the attractions? The attractions were first this amazing river, clear, clean, with a marvelous bounty of trout. It was a fly fisherman's paradise, a canoe river, mountain ridges that are a sort of an extension north from Hosameen, almost following the patterns of the North Cascades National Park. It was very popular for recreation. However, in 1967, our provincial government made a sweetheart deal with Seattle to lease the land that Seattle wanted to flood by raising the dam for $5.50 an acre per annum. And that was so low, it would be a total income for the year of less than $30,000, that it just raised the ire of all the conservationists around. So we formed a group called the Rust Committee to run out Skagit spoilers. And we pursued the provincial government. We pursued our federal government because this was an international river. We got support from the federal government. We joined forces with the North Cascades Conservation Council. We presented before the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in the US. And ultimately, the province conceded, and I think under some nudging from the International Joint Commission, and made an agreement with Seattle in 1983, which was the Skagit Treaty. And that really was a sort of a major point forward. Since then, things have gone up and down. The province put a protective area status on most of the area, called a recreation area status. Then they later refined that and put most of it into a provincial park, which was good, no mining, but the area where there was a long established group of claims, they let it revert to Crown land. And this is where immediately we started to have problems. And so the arguments built up again as to what to do. But the Skagit Treaty had a very interesting side issue. In a side agreement between BC and Seattle, it established the Skagit Environmental Endowment Commission, which was jointly funded by both parties to the agreement, and which, by the standards of the day, was given a very green agenda. And one of those items in that agenda was to acquire the mining claims that existed in the area, which were held by Imperial. So since that time, a lot of attention is focused on how to get those mining claims extinguished, and in effect, purchased and returned to the province of British Columbia. To date, we have been unsuccessful in completing the deal, and the next person up can talk about that. But let's put it in perspective. Those mining claims have been staked and known for 90 years. 3 major Canadian companies have looked at those: Caminco, Giant Mascot, and Imperial, all with a reputation for having developed mines, and none of them has moved forward. That tells you something about the standard of what's there. It's a small deposit. It's in a very difficult situation, geographically, politically, environmentally. The question is, would it ever really be permittable, even by the standards of British Columbia? I don't think it would, but the negotiations will prove to be very difficult, and because it's hard to see the pressures that can be built on the company. So there is one item that does influence this, and that is when the Alsek-Tatsunshini Park was established by the previous NDP government, going back now to the 1970s. There were a series of mining claims there called the Windy Craggy claims, and they were expropriated to create the Alsek-Tatsunshini Park. The mining industry reacted so violently against this that the current government is unwilling, I believe, to move towards expropriation. So this leaves a very difficult negotiation. And I think there's the history for you. A prime recreation area, mining claims surrounded by beautiful recreation country, all well served from the highway, from different points of access, a real key recreation area for the Lower Mainland, including the water resources. So a long-standing problem, but it will be brought to conclusion, I am sure.
Is that your conclusion, Ken?
That is my conclusion.
Thank you. I really appreciate it. One thing I didn't mention about Ken is that he's a former commissioner of the Skagit Environmental Endowment Commission, and we're now honored to have a present commissioner of the Endowment Commission. Dennis McLerran was the administrator for this region of the Environmental Protection Agency, Region 10. He serves on the Skagit Environmental Endowment Commission now, and he's also practicing law at the Cascadia Law Firm. Dennis, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Mitch, and I'm honored to be participating with this great panel. I'm today on the traditional lands of the Skagit Tribes, where I'm living now, and I'm going to give you a little bit of about the Skagit Environmental Endowment Commission, a little more than Ken laid out, and I can say that that commission and the treaty between the U.S. and Canada probably wouldn't exist without the work of Ken. And, you know, we owe a lot to him in terms of sticking with it over the years as well. So, Ken, thank you very much for that. And I should also say that much of my education about mining and fish has come from folks like Dan Schindler and Dave Chambers as I worked on issues like the Pebble Mine and the cross-boundary mines along the Alaska Panhandle with the State Department and others. So, what I can say about the Skagit Environmental Endowment Commission is that it was formed by that treaty that Ken mentioned back in 83, 84. And it is 8 members, 8 on each side of the border, 4 permanent commissioners in British Columbia, 4 alternates, and they're appointed by the BC Premier. On the Washington side, they're appointed by the Mayor of Seattle, again, 4 commissioners and 4 alternates. And the mission of the SEEK is to ensure the preservation and protection of the natural and cultural resources and the recreational opportunities of the Upper Skagit watershed. So again, as Ken said, very much a mission of preserving the values that were saved when the treaty was made and the dam was not raised. And so we have a vision statement where the upper watershed is recognized and appreciated as a unique and ecologically significant North American treasure to be protected forever and managed as a single ecosystem. And certainly, you know, we have a strategic plan as well, and certainly our strategic plan is focused on some key objectives, which include eliminating the threats to the public lands from mining tenures and forest harvesting in that area. And as Ken said, the big challenge is now the mining tenures in what is called the donut hole, which is in wilderness areas that are right at the center of the Upper Skagit. And you know, we recognize that if a mine were to be established there, it would have potentially devastating effects on those resources and recreational values. And we also, of course, recognize that the Skagit watershed has been a home and a gathering place and a trading place for First Nations and tribal nations since time immemorial. So we're very interested in working with the First Nations and the tribes in partnership to extinguish these mining tenures. We don't ever want to get to the place where there is more mine exploration or in fact the development of a mine. And in fact, we think that, as Ken mentioned, that these mining tenures are not viable from an economic standpoint, but the mining company is Imperial Metals, the same mining company that experienced the Mount Poly disaster. So not a company that's easily giving up those mining tenures. And we're very focused on how can we create additional pressure on the BC government to assist us in bringing Imperial Metals to the table in a good faith negotiation to extinguish those tenures. They think it's worth quite a lot of money. We think it's not worth much money at all. But we know that the watershed is extremely valuable and has high importance to many, many people and tribes and First Nations. So our focus is on what work can we be doing, not only to do the traditional work that the SEEK has done, which is supporting educational work and getting people into the watershed and appreciating its value, but now extinguishing those mining tenures before they become a real threat and a serious problem at the core of the watershed. So I think that's it for my presentation, open to questions. And again, thank you for having me as part of this panel and being able to explain what the SEEK is about.
Thank you, Dennis. And thank you to all the panelists this evening. My head is spinning with questions and ideas. Thank you all so much for your time and expertise. But we're going to start with some Q&A that we received in advance of the webinar, as well as some questions that have come in during the webinar, in fact. And Dennis, I'm just going to kick it right back to you. You mentioned the work that SEEK is doing, under the High-Ross Treaty and the coordination with with SEEK and your partners in British Columbia. But one of the questions we received is, can you talk a little bit about other state and federal actions that can be taken to ensure long-term protections of, I think the question was posed for specifically the Skagit, but I would submit all of these transboundary systems?
So, that is a really interesting question. The policies of both the British Columbia government and the states within the United States have favored mining. They've created laws and property interests that have allowed mine exploration and mining activities to go on for many, many years without a lot of regulation. And many of our Superfund cleanups that we do in the US have been cleaning up the problems that folks like Dave pointed out when mining goes bad. So in some instances, I've been very involved in the Pebble Mine controversy in Alaska. In some instances, it is using US federal authorities under the Clean Water Act to establish protections. We tried to do that during the Obama administration with Pebble, and unfortunately in the Trump administration, they've reversed the good work that we did there. The science is still strong. The watershed assessment that we did is still strong. But those things shift with political winds. I worked with the State Department and with the state of Alaska and with the Tlingit-Haida Central Council, President Peterson and others, to work on reaching agreement with British Columbia with respect to the mines adjacent to the Alaska Panhandle. And in that instance, what we were trying to do was establish water quality monitoring, establish communication, establish input into the mining practices and the permitting processes. But again, British Columbia has sovereignty, and the U.S. Can only impact that through things like the International Joint Commission and through continuous pressure to do the right thing. But Tulsa Chief, which was mentioned, that has been a mine that has been polluting the river there for many, many years, and British Columbia has promised to clean it up multiple times and has not gotten there. So it's a very frustrating exercise, but continuous pressure, focusing tribal nations, First Nations, recreational groups and others to establish, particularly where there are high values to a watershed, is probably the strongest tool. And that is, what we're trying to bring to bear with respect to the donut hole is enough pressure from enough people to say this is too important an area to allow mining to occur.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Dennis. I think, Joe, if you don't mind, I'll take the next question for myself, which kind of follows off of where Kevin was, and then one for other panelists. The question is, what ways can concerned Americans most effectively bring pressure on Canadian politicians to better regulate their mines? And I certainly agree with what Dennis was saying about the International Joint Commission and others. But I'd encourage folks to contact Governor Inslee's office, as well as your legislators. Chase, if you don't mind, if you could put up that image of the Red Chris Mines Tailings Dam. Right now in the upper Similkameen, where Rob Edward was talking about, the impacts of mining on the quality of the water in the river, and the headwaters is a giant tailings lake backed up by two giant dams. It's basically mining waste trapped between dams that block two sides of a valley. And we don't have an image of that, but it looks a lot like this. And if we had a Mount Poly type event that caused a breach in that dam, it would travel down, good distance of that river and probably far enough to cross into Washington State. And hopefully when we get the Enlow Dam removed, a downside of that would be it would allow an event like this to pollute all the way down to the Okanagan River and maybe onto the Columbia. So we are affected, we in Washington are affected by what goes on in the headwaters in BC. And the political dimension to that means that the governor and our legislators, we're a key trade partner to British Columbia. It's a really important relationship. And that gives a certain amount of leverage. When Governor Inslee tells Premier Horgan that this is an important issue that we're concerned about, that hopefully plays a role. So it's not our place as Washingtonians and Americans to contact the British Columbian government, but it certainly is our place to contact our own government and say this is a concern of ours. Jill, do you want to grab the next one?
Sure, yeah, put me on the spot, Mitch.
Sorry.
I'm going to kind of pitch this, I think, to the panel. What is the importance of transparency among Indigenous groups throughout these transboundary regions? And primarily, I'm asking Rob and Scott and Amelia in particular, just as it relates. I'm more familiar up here with the fact that there are multiple First Nations on the British Columbia side of the border within the three watersheds that we work within, as well as multiple tribes on the Southeast Alaska side. And so I'm just curious if you could answer this question as far as, BC, and if one of you wanted to potentially speak to the passage of UNDRIP legislation and potentially what the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples has done thus far or is intended to do as far as creating transparency between government to government conversations.
I think I would kick that to Rob, but I know from our standpoint, we want to work closely with our cousins north of the border, east of the Cascades, and work more closely with our communities. We're all related to each other, and I think it was 2 years ago we traveled and met with the SOS group in the Similkameen area and started building those relationships. And we want to work closely together, have a transparent relationship, so we can work together to do what is right here, and to simply, you know, we have all of our reasons why we want to protect these watersheds. All of them, they all have their special qualities, their importance to each and every one of us. But inherently, you know, the most important reason is it's the right thing to do. We have to protect these watersheds. And once they're destroyed, you can't get them back. Not in our lifetime, not in our kids' lifetime. And so we have to continue to work together with everybody that's willing to achieve our objective of protecting these precious watersheds. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott.
I'll defer to Rob if he wants to answer that also.
All right. I guess I can. Yeah. Well, how I think about the transparency is probably just awakening the protocols that we've had for thousands of years. Like I said, downstream, you know, we've had a really good relationship in the past with our downstream and our neighbors. So when I was thinking about, you know, you guys are talking about the donut hole, well, that's part of our territory as Similkameen people. And we call that Nihtulal. And like I talked earlier, you know, the Skagit River has two meanings for us. The uppermost Skagit part is refers to a Ka'idit. Ka'idit means we're getting close to the Tlemsiu, the Stolo people, because it's not very far down the trail there, and we're in Hope. But you look down the river the other way is where the Skagit live, the people of the Skagit. So when I think about that, I said, you know, the protection of water, I think, is one of the things that we envision up here is working with the Kabul Tribe to adopt their water quality standards. Because I don't think here in British Columbia they have a standard. They don't have a Clean Water Act that really has teeth to it, in my mind. Neither does the federal government. So along with the Skagit, if they have a water quality standard that, you know, we could adopt and refine or, you know, fit into what we're doing. We're developing water law right now. In 2015, our legal advisors to our nation told us we have to start standing up our laws. We still have them. It's just they're not codified or, you know, written up like the Western law is. It's all in our Zaptic and our protocols and different things that we use. And as far as UNDRIP is concerned, I don't think it's really being implemented to its fullest yet. It is adopted, and like our scholars and other people would say, it really doesn't have teeth. You know, it's not law binding. But when you look at the Royal Proclamation of 1763, that's referred to in Section 35 in the Constitution of Canada, that has teeth. And the more we start talking about that, the more we start reviewing that and bringing that up, it starts to override some of their claims, like their water acts and their legislation. Because when I look at it, you know, it needs to be studied more. So when I think about that, and I think some of the small steps we're taking now as we are talking with Amelia and Nat, and we want to adopt their water standards, the water quality standards, because they're downstream. They've been at it a little longer than we were. And, you know, just now we're starting to stand up and saying, you know, this is our law. You know, it's not a free reign for those companies like imperial minerals to throw up a mine. And we've already been living through, 100 years of a mine, Similko back in the early days, the Mascot mine in Headley. We're still living that every day. And that affects our food sovereignty. That affects our health. That affects every aspect of our lives. So when I think about, we need to get together as nations, the Skagit, or Snaxil down across the line, that, the line that was put there by a treaty with, as it was. I always like to point that out. In the J Treaty, it says, the Crown and its subjects hereby do this treaty with American citizens. That still to me stands, and I go back and forth on that, when I bring goods and different things.
Yep.
So when I think about that, I said, it's us educating ourselves and pushing and adopting what is already there. Don't reinvent the wheel, give us your standards, help us with that. And that unifies us. So when I look at, the defeat of Tekminko in the Columbia River is a huge thing. And here, we're starting to push back. We're starting to say, well, no, this is affecting us. Not just for, a week or two or a month or 10 years or 2 centuries. That has to stop. Because right now we're not on the fence anymore. We're not sitting on the sidelines. We're in the rooms talking about this stuff. We work with University of UVic, I think it's University of Victoria, talking about our water law. We're working with another group, I think they're environmental law, and we're doing the same thing. And the reason we're going at water first is because in our Tzaptik, Chutin made water first, and then he made the land, and then the Tamich, and then Skailuch, us. So we followed that. And we have water, forest, silk forest standards. And right now we're tackling the water part of that, the riparian areas and that kind of a thing. So I look at that, I said, UNDRIP to me, has no teeth, but the Royal Proclamation does.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you, Rob. Let's try and sneak in one more quick question. I think it's a good one for Dave Chambers, and then we'll go to Scott Schuyler to wrap us up, and we'll get you all to dinner on time. But this will be my last moment to thank all the panelists and everybody who attended. I've learned a lot and enjoyed it. So Dave Chambers, there's a question about responsible mining. Are there models, are there ways to mine with less impact? And when Dave is done, Scott, take it away.
Well, there are some efforts internationally to foster responsible mining. An organization that's come about actually almost a decade ago now, called the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance, IRMA, is the only effort that I'm aware of that actually is multi-stakeholder. Every other responsible mining effort, whether it be a governmental body or the UN or a trade association or whatever, those are all essentially unilateral efforts. But this IRMA effort, again, it's not going to solve all the problems, but it is an effort to foster responsible mining techniques. That's probably the best one that I'm aware of out there.
Thank you, Dave. I'd like to thank the panel, and again, it's been an honor to be here, and it's been very informational. And what I hope to achieve for all of us is to build on what we've started here today and move collectively to protect these watersheds, and again, not just for ourselves, for our children. So again, thank everybody. Let's take this initiative, and thank you for all the great work that all of you have done in your individual watersheds, and for this on behalf of the Upper Skagit. Thank you again. So thanks everyone. Ashka.
Good night.
Hmm.
Good night.